doing on my channel here. And today we're actually going to be talking about another species. We're going to be talking about gnomes. Now, I've only seen gnomes kind of interpreted in one of two ways. Either they can be the super smart and gadgety kind of gnomes that can fix it or come up with anything on the spot and do stuff, or they could be funny and clueless, like in No Country for Old Gnome. Yeah. So, regardless, we're gonna go with the former. And so, my gnome for future fantasy isn't actually going to be so much as your typical gnome, but I'm actually thinking of something along the lines of the Assurance from Guild Wars 2, which is a really good MMORPG. So in Guild Wars 2, there's this race, the subterranean race called the Assurance, and they are a very techno savvy kind of people. They have communities called crews, which are kind of like think of it like a lab firm where they do research and studies and experiments and all sorts of cool things like that. And so that's kind of the whole vibe that I wanted to bring the gnomes in the future fantasy sort of settings. And so, without further ado, there's a couple of basics that we're going to get into. For example, the gnome homeworld, which is actually called Homeworld. Gnomes actually don't have a whole lot of time for coming up with the names of things, so they just kind of come up with a general name. So their homeworld is actually called Homeworld, and this is a long time ago. This homeworld was actually a what you would probably typically find in a fantasy setting. It was full of hills and forests and subterranean caverns where the gnomes would live and eat mushrooms and stuff like that. And they would actually build their laboratories on this homeworld as well. But over time, something happened. The gnomes actually polluted their home world. Huh. Doesn't that sound familiar? And so over time, this homeworld became polluted, and it was very hard to live in without, like exosuits and stuff like that. And then there was the Cataclysm, which was a ginormous experiment gone wrong. And so this basically made it homeworld uninhabitable unless you're living in an exosuit or on one of their sealed off labs or something like that. And a few labs actually do that. There are a couple of labs that are stationed on Homeworld, and those are going to be your more prominent ones, but we'll get into that here in just a second. So, the Homeworld has been kind of decimated by experiments gone wrong and just pollution and negligence in general. And so what the gnomes did, they actually built something called the Ringworld, which is uh, think of it in terms of Halo. It's a Halo ring that surrounds the planet of Homeworld. And the thing is, nobody or no outside influences or humans or anything like that. Only gnomes can go to Homeworld, and with a specific permission from whatever labs are actually running there. And so the gnomes actually built Ringworld around Homeworld in order to invite other species in, to collectively share their knowledge and whatnot. And every 5 years is a huge event, which we'll also get into because that's a very big part of the gnome culture. So there's Homeworld, and then there's Ringworld, which is just where all of the gnomes considered the home world, I guess. Yeah, terminology can be a little bit confusing in terms of gnomes. So let's talk about gnome personalities. Like, what is a typical gnome like in the future fantasy? So gnomes tend to talk fast. They are very smart. They think they're the smartest person in the room, and so they tend to be very scientific in the way that they talk to other species and stuff like that. And so I really wanted there to be a really smart species. And even if it just kind of seemed like nonsense smart, I still wanted like the gnome people to be smart. And so that brings us to the culture of the gnomes. So gnome culture is all centered around being the most intelligent or having the best idea. So a gnome from a very young age is going to be going through like all these super advanced academic courses. Like some of our like what we would consider elementary school or primary school, a gnome would be doing like AP math at that age. So they're raising their young to be very smart from a very early age. And rightfully so, because the gnomes are a very technologically big powerhouse in this universe. They like to make gadgets, and some of their labs are actually weaponsmiths. They make weapons that have like elemental damage and stuff like that. So you're gonna need smart people to do stuff like that. So gnomes, when they reach early adulthood, they're allowed to go out on this pilgrimage, kind of like how the Quarians in Mass Effect. They're allowed to go out on a pilgrimage. They're allowed to go out adventuring, so they can get the spark. And the spark is like an idea, a big idea, something that just pops up. It's like the light bulb going off in your head, and this is the idea that you're going to present to the what did I call it? The Gnome Ethical Committee, which is kind of like the gnome government in a way. But every 5 years, there is this big event on Ringworld. It's called the Galaxy Fair or the Galactic Fair. So think of it in terms of our World Fair from days gone long past. So this is where the gnomes have like a week-long event where they showcase different experiments and scientific breakthroughs, and they actually invite other species in, but 5 of those days of the week are just gnome experiments, just showcasing gnome ingenuity. And then the last 2 days are for like other species. So gnomes are kind of, they think very big of themselves in that regard as well. So every 5 years there's this event, and in order for a young adult gnome to ascend into full adulthood and actually get a job as a crew member in a lab, they actually have to present their spark idea at this Galaxy Fair, and then the gnome ethical committee will actually kind of review it, and then if they pass, they are ascended to adulthood. So likewise, if your idea doesn't pass, that means you have to wait a whole 5 other years to present another idea at the Galaxy Fair. So you might have gnomes that are quite aged up there, but aren't actually technically considered adults in that way. And so it's a very unique way of presenting a little bit of a subdivision in the gnome species. So on one hand, you have these gnomes that are considered adults. I'll probably come up with some sort of a gnomish name for it later, but you have this one side of the gnome culture that are adults that actually work in labs and are super smart, and then you have this other side that have yet to really ascend to adulthood, and these gnomes can actually work for labs, just not in like an official way. So espionage is actually something that we would find here in the gnome culture. So one lab will actually hire one of these gnomes for espionage purposes to go to another lab and maybe infiltrate and gather that lab's secrets, and maybe sabotage their big experiment that they're going to reveal for the Galaxy Fair. Because at the Galaxy Fair or the Galactic Fair, there is a best in show prize, I guess, for the lab or the single gnome that presents their findings. And so it's a very big honor. It's something that every gnome aspires to want to claim in their lifehood. And so only the very best, experiments or showcases get picked. And this is all chosen by the Gnome Ethical Committee. Sorry, that's a term that I just created like on the spot that actually sounds pretty good to me. So that happens every 5 years. So these gnomes, they tend to work in a lab. So likewise, a young gnome who has yet to ascend to young adulthood also lives with their parents in these lab quarters or wherever these labs are. And these labs can actually be, out in the middle of nowhere where nobody's going to find them or has any reason to go there, either for research purposes or because they don't want to be found because they are fearful of espionage from different races or even gnomes themselves. So these labs, majority of them are going to be research. A few of them are going to be weapons labs. And so, like I said before, these weapons labs are going to be like very big powerhouses. Like having one of these weapons gnome made that can do like fire damage in addition to whatever the normal damage is for that type of weapon, is going to be like highly sought after. Think of it in terms of Borderlands, where you have the different companies or corporations that make these weapons. Some of them do like some pretty crazy stuff, like add fire damage, or some of them might penetrate through your shields. So that's the kind of tech that we're talking about here with these gnomes. These gnomes know what they're doing, and they make these really crazy weapons and gadgets and stuff like that, and it's going to be really cool. And like I said before, some of these companies actually do work on Homeworld, but very few, because remember, Homeworld is it's not habitable any longer. So these labs down on Homeworld are actually sealed off in like some sort of environment containment system, and going outside, a gnome would have to wear an exoskeleton. And they would only be able to, or an exosuit, and they would only be able to really go out there for not a lengthy period of time. So gnome politics. This one I actually had a little bit of fun developing. So for gnome politics, the Gnome Ethical Committee is basically the government of the gnome people. They oversee laboratory practices, and it's all very bureaucratic in a sort of sense. So a lab can determine its own laws because it's like a mini community, so to speak. It's like a town. But the Gnome Ethical Committee would be the federal system in terms of North America or the United States government. So the Gnome Ethical Committee would actually create federal laws that all labs have to go by. And they do enforce that too. I mean, just like the real federal system works here in the United States. And so they elect one gnome to be the diplomat that sits on the Galactic Council. And this is a forever position in gnome terms. It's a forever position that so once a gnome is elected, they stay on there forever or until death. So a gnome actually kind of despises this position because that means that they're not able to go about doing research or fulfilling their own fulfilling their own ideas that are running in their heads, because gnomes, once they get an idea, they want to follow through with it, and it's very hard to do that if you're constantly sitting on the Galactic Council. So this position is not very sought after in the gnome community. In fact, when a gnome is getting ready to quote unquote retire because they're getting old, it might be, or the Gnome Ethical Committee might actually elect the best in show for that year's Galactic Fair, and they will have that specific gnome sit on the council for them. And so in terms of a group project, so let's say that Lab Maui would be, they're at the Galactic Fair presenting their experiment or their scientific research. And so that Lab Maui is going to be run by one gnome who's got these ideas that are just going through his head, and he's constantly, he's the administrator of that lab. So all credit would technically go to that gnome who's the administrator of that lab. So he would be elected to go sit on the Galactic Council for the gnomes position. And so it's not a very sought after position for the gnomes. If anything, if there is a year where it's known that the Gnome Ethical Committee is going to elect a gnome to the galactic seat, it is not uncommon for a gnome lab to kind of sabotage their own work there, just so they don't get best in show. So that's kind of all that I have for the gnomes, at least at this moment. And I think I have some pretty concrete ideas here for the gnomes. I really had a lot of fun with this one. Just because it's a little wacky, but it kind of makes sense in it a little bit, and it's just something different than humans and dwarves. And the dwarves I'm kind of still struggling with. So I do have at least a couple questions. So I'm still thinking about a progenitor race. And I won't make that decision until much later in the cycle of the basic ideas. But one of the ideas that I'm going to start thinking about is what kind of a galactic government should we run? So I've already hinted that there's like a council, but that's still not kind of concrete at this moment. So I want to start figuring out how does the galactic community function in terms of government, especially when the other species have been elected into the galactic government overall. So, like we said, that the Tabaxi race or the Cat People race found a position, the high diplomatic tier, by creating the Galactic Economy Standard or something like that. And so, I'm going to start thinking about how to create a galactic government. And so I guess my question would be, what kind of a galactic government should we have in future fantasy? And so if you would like to kind of send a reply in the comments down below, or even just giving me some ideas like these are the different types of galactic governments that have been in these sources of literature, then definitely leave those in the comments, because I really do want to do some research on that right now. So next week I plan to have the elves kind of detailed a little bit, or at least I'll have one of the elves. There's actually going to be 3 different elves, elven variations. So I'm actually going to have at least the main type of elf detailed a little bit. And so feel free to leave those comments down below. Give this video a huge thumbs up to support this series, and subscribe if you would like to see more. And I will see you guys in the next video.